So this week I had announced that I was going to do a video on why being beloved by the gods is not necessarily something that an individual pagan could or should really want, based off of all sorts of evidence from the mythology, including heroes, and often the way that people would express themselves on their votive offerings in temples and the like. But as I worked on that script, I realized that that topic actually had a lot of background topics that I needed to get into first for other people to have enough understanding. By the time that I got into the 10th page of the script, I realized that this was multiple videos worth of info. So, in the interest of still getting you guys out a video on time, I went and talked to my patrons because I had this script already ready for the Dionysia for a bonus video that was supposed to happen. We're not going to talk about how many months ago. Patrons said that they were fine with me recording and charging for this particular video and making sure that I get my content out. So, with that out of the way, here is the original intro and script for the Dionysia video. Thank you again for my patrons and your patience with me and my inability to grasp the incredible depth of half the topics I attempt to tackle on this channel. Dionysia was a massive festival. Well, two festivals, rural and city. And from the competitive and jovial atmosphere, the great playwrights of ancient Athens were birthed, and their skills were honed to a razor's edge. Aristophanes, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, and many others all came to prominence competing in their respective genres in these competitions, while people of high and low families watched their work through the day. Thank you to Brian R. for the suggested topic, and to all of my patrons. This one was for you. Karate. Dionysia is a huge topic in and of itself. Massive offerings were given to Dionysus in the form of bulls being slaughtered and communal feasting, but there were also various processions and competitions that were considered essential as well. I'm going to talk primarily about the city Dionysia in this video, as there's much less available on the so-called rural Dionysia and its timing. It wasn't really one event from my understanding. It was multiple smaller events that were put on by the various royal houses, so rural is a little bit of a misnomer. Royal is a little bit of a misnomer as well. They were more like aristocratic houses. There was at least the semblance of a sort of oligarchic democracy within Athens. In the future, I might devote an entire video to the topic of the rural Dionysia. If my sources mention something about a particular aspect shared between the two, I'll be sure to mention it here. According to H.W. Park in Festivals of the Athenians, the city Dionysia started ritually some days earlier, when a wooden statue was removed from the temple in the city by the Eleutherai and housed in the gymnasium sanctuary at the academy. He wasn't quite sure on the dates, and sources are vague, but on the 8th or 9th of Elaphobolion, it would be brought back with an escort to the temple beside the Dionysiac Theater just before the festivities began on the 10th. It was referred to as bringing in from the sacrificial hearth, and was distinct from the procession that happened again on the 10th, where bulls and other sacrificial animal offerings were brought in at the beginning of the city festival. For the record, Elaphobolion generally occurs between February and March. In 2020, the statue would have been returned on the 3rd or 4th of March, and the festivities would have begun on the 5th. I've got a video in the works later this year explaining the various months and discussing the monthly offering calendar, but for now, that approximate timing should give you an idea of where in the year we were sitting. In my video on the Athenian New Year, which actually occurred closer to July, I mentioned the massive procession that would happen right before Panathenaia, or the games and festivities done to celebrate the founding of Athens and honor heroes and gods associated with the myths surrounding the city-state. There was a similar procession on the 10th of Elaphobolion, except significantly more, debaucherous. Well, the bulls were brought in for the sacrificial feasts. Large and small representations of pocket rockets would be carried by those in the procession in honor of a myth in which Dionysos was not received with due honors by the Athenians, and punished the entire city by afflicting the special parts of the men with a horrendous disease. Now that all of the men in my audience have crossed their legs, after appealing to the oracle at Delphi, they were told to carry a gigantic model of themselves in procession, as well as accepting the god with the honors he actually deserved. In other words, not mocking his mini Dionysos. They did so, and the disease was lifted, and ever after, phalli could be seen parading through the city as the procession made its way to the theater. Much like the Panathenaea, the various social classes of Athens played different roles during the procession. Non-citizens would wear purple robes and carry trays of food offerings. Citizens would wear whatever they wanted and carry leather bottles of wine on their shoulders. And one specific highborn maiden would be chosen as the Kanephoros to walk in procession and carry a golden basket of first fruits harvests of grapes. The offerings would include narrow, rod-shaped loaves of bread called obeliai, which were carried on the shoulders like the leather containers by citizens. We don't have any records of the procession route, but it did stop in several places for dances given an offering to the gods. When they reached the altar near the Dionysiac theater, over 200 bulls would be sacrificed. The bones and fat burned in honor of the god, and the meat cooked and served to the populace in a feast. Later that night, a komos, or revelry, would happen by torchlight, as well-fed drunken men sang, danced, and enjoyed themselves well into the night. After the 6th century BCE, the next day was when the performance of the plays began. By the end of the 6th century, plays would be performed in threes, followed by a satyr play, which had the chorus of the play dressed as the half-animal companions of Dionysos. In 486 BCE, comedy came to the Dionysia, which at first took place in the natural setting of a similar shape to a theater, and later in the 4th century became a fully carved stone theater. Resident aliens, citizens, and foreigners were all allowed to obtain tickets for admission, which cost approximately 1 full day's labor and therefore were a little out of the range of poorer Athenian families. For these folks, though, a tax fund was established so that every citizen could at least attend one or more of the plays. It was thought that the city had around 20 to 30,000 people during this time, and the theater could seat around 17,000. It's unknown whether or not women could attend. Sourcing is mixed, between the plays themselves implying that there were no women, mostly comedies, to some appealing directly to women supposed to be in the audience. One theory is that women were allowed to see tragedy but not comedy. On the second day, those with admission would take their seats. Those closest were reserved for the magistrates and other high officials, the priests and priestesses of various gods, and foreign travelers of special note. The presiding official of the ceremony would be the priest of Dionysos, and Park states that some older sources suggest that the wooden statue from the earlier procession would also attend and get its own seat. The rest of the tickets were the equivalent of modern-day standing room only, where folks would start having to form lines very early in the hopes of getting a closer unreserved seat. Folks were advised to bring their own cushions for the typical admission, though special admissions received these provided by the polis. It would have taken some time to get through the entertainment. The typical programming was 3 tragedies followed by a satyr play, then a long break in the afternoon, then a comedy. Sweetmeats and wine were consumed, both of these brought by the attending and sold by sellers standing in the gameways. 4 days straight of these festivities were typical in the 4th century, dropping to 3 during the Peloponnesian War, then increasing back to 4 or sometimes even more during the Hellenistic era. As for how the plays were chosen, the process was elaborate. The Archon would appoint 3 wealthy individuals as choreogos for tragedies, 5 for comedies, and 3 for each choral groups of men and boys that would sing hymns to Dionysos throughout the event. These men were trained, had actors assigned to them, and had a poet assigned to them. The choice of poets by the Archon also consisted of a competition, where the poets would submit their works, and those that the Archon deemed the best would compete on the day. Choreogoi were responsible for training their actors, the expensive costuming, and working with the poets to produce the best show possible for the competition. Those who skimped out on the expense, due to the low chances of being able to bribe the judges before the selection process, as I'm about to outline, had a far lower chance of doing well. It was a sacred duty. The panel of judges were chosen by a much more random system designed to guard against bribery or favoritism. Names of the candidates were added to 10 jars, which were then sealed and deposited at the Acropolis. A A name would be drawn from each, and at the end of the festival, the judges would write the names of their favorites in each category in order. These would then be placed in another jar, 5 would be drawn, and the consensus of the 5 would rank the winners. This is also the day that the ships of tribute from all around Attica were due, bringing the tributes for both Panathenaia and for the Dionysia. Bags of coins would be dragged up onto the stage between productions to show off the wealth of the empire, but shortly after the Ophrons' sons of those fallen in previous wars would come up to the stage and recognize the sacrifice of their fathers. They would parade across the stage in full hoplite armor, then be escorted to the reserved seats to enjoy the festivities. The air of competition produced during the Dionysia shaped comedy and tragedy for the ages. Many of the works we still know to this day were produced during the city Dionysia, and copies of the most influential were produced and given to theater production bands who would put on these plays in more rural areas for the year for those who couldn't make it all the way to Athens at the time. Due to the festival's religious nature, these plays were considered a form of sacred art, though often comedy and tragedy would both comment on a combination of socio-political and theological concerns. Aristophanes' The Birds comments on the nature of godhood and the relationship between divinity and humanity, as well as the complexities of Athenian politics at the time. There's a great deal of evidence, both in the way that the plays are referenced by philosophers such as Plato, who regarded them as vulgar and corrupting influence rather than one that added anything to the ongoing theological conversation. But there is evidence from other sources that shows often these plays were read as works of literature that bent, rather than completely distorted, deeper truths. There is capital T truth buried underneath the truths of the story itself. Gorgias, when defining tragedy, stated that tragedy is a deceit in which the deceiver is more just than one who did not deceive, and the deceived is more wise than one who was not deceived. In other words, as Margalite Finkelberg writes in her paper The City Dionysia and the Social Space of Attic Tragedy, though poets were often said to lie, the lies of these poets were always seen as a distortion of the greater truth. Athenian audiences would get deeply invested in the stories told and would lose themselves to huge displays of emotion if the work was good enough to evoke it, engaging in a form of catharsis that was often denied in regular Greek life, where emotions were often suppressed outside of funerals and festivals. The way later philosophers referred to these plays makes it clear that these stories held a similar level to authority in the theological realm to myth. In fact, sometimes could even shape or expand upon myth, in much the way that modern fanfiction allows for fans to explore their own creativity and the works of the things that they themselves love. Tragedy and comedy are also extremely useful for the Reconstructionist, as we get to see slightly distorted pieces of contemporary life of the time, in much the same way a sitcom or movie can give us a glimpse into a fictive version of another culture or our own. Although Dionysia is not the only festival at which plays were conducted or even the only literary contest, its effect on the cultural life of Athens cannot be denied, and an aspiring Hellenist would be foolish to dismiss the literary products as lesser than that of the written epics of Homer and Hesiod. Many of these plays still hold sway in the modern day, such as Oedipus Tyrannos, also known today as Oedipus Rex, its Roman name. So how would a modern Hellenist go about celebrating the Dionysia? Well, if you're artistically inclined, writing your own plays, stories, songs, or poetry as a dedication to the gods during the traditional time would be a great way to do so. Or, if you're less artistically inclined, reading some of the old plays, either in the original Greek or translations, could help deepen your understanding of the ancient culture and religion that birthed the idea. Look up the names of soldiers fallen in recent wars and make a small offering in their names if you're comfortable, or honor your ancestors that were veterans. Try making a feast of bread and or meat. If you're in a safe situation, bake a phallic loaf of bread, or even just a very long skinny loaf that is absolutely not shaped like somebody's particular idea of a good time. Go enjoy a local production sometime during the week if you can afford it and there's one nearby. In fact, you can actually look up and see that most even small towns have some local theater production company or even a high school that's putting on a play. Incorporate wine or grapes into your meals, and do a special ritual to Dionysos, thanking him for the gifts of mirth and celebration and insight that he brings. And remember, Just because we don't necessarily have these incredible productions and festivals that are a part of our intrinsic culture to this day, though there do appear to be remnants of this one in Greece, I've played footage from that earlier in the video, it doesn't mean that your personal celebration of these things is any less meaningful. And I hope that this video helped give you a better understanding of the core purpose and honors that would have been performed during this one, so that when you create your own traditions, you feel confident in doing so, and in the honor that you wish to bring to the gods. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, throw peanuts at the subscribe button and cast your vote for like or dislike in the jar. Drop down into the comments and tell me about what you learned, or just tell me that I'm wasting my time caring about comedy and tragedy as theological fodder if that's your speed. Special thanks to my patrons. The folks scrolling by on your screen are the reason that I could have access to the paid version of JSTOR and pick up the rather rare book that I found reference for this video. There were a ton of papers that I had to go through to gather together this particular set of information, and thanks to all of them, I don't have to worry about where my next meal is coming from while we're dealing with tons and tons of medical expenses and other complications. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.